Hey there. We at Blue Wire just wanted to take a second to thank you for listening to this podcast. We know everything outside is pretty scary and uncertain, but we're committed to helping you get through your day by talking about the sports and teams that you love most. If you're looking for more great podcasts to distract you, check out BlueWirePods.com. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the podcast and stay safe.
What is poppin', Hardwood Knocks listeners? I am Dan Valley, coming at you once again without Andrew D. Bailey. I am, however, as usual, super pleased to be joined by Adam Frommel. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of NBA Math. We are continuing our player decade rankings for each and every team. We are up to the Chicago Bulls. Before we get into a conversation with him, I just want to continue reminding, imploring, begging, and pleading with everyone. Rate, review, subscribe to us on iTunes. That's the best way to help out the show. If you've done all those things, if you're listening to us on another podcast player already, make sure you're downloading all our episodes. Please retweet the promotions that we're coming up with for these exercises. Anything you could do to help us continue to build this community, we'd be very much appreciative of. Last but certainly not least, shout out to our sponsor, betonline.ag, for making this podcast possible. You'll be hearing from them in just a short while. But for now, let's get to talking some Chicago Bulls player rankings with Adam Frommel. Adam, how goes it?
It's going pretty well. You know, you and I were just talking before we started recording about how my almost 16-month-old son is learning his Marvel superheroes, so he can do the Black Panther Wakanda symbol. He loves saying Yondu. So I feel like it's been a good, successful morning for me so far.
You know he's going to end up being awesome because he's doing the Black Panther symbol already. So he's already got good taste in the Marvel.
That's my hope. It's one of the few things I've done right so far, I think.
Just make sure he doesn't grow up to love Thor 2, and then everything in his life will fall into place after that.
I mean, that's going to be tough because Thor is definitely my wife's favorite, both because of the character and Chris Hemsworth.
I like Thor 1 and I love Thor 3, but Thor 2 was, and I'm pretty I don't know what the word would be. I feel like I'm basic when it comes to movies and TV shows. And so you'll very rarely hear me say that I hate anything, but Thor 2 was just not great. I'll still watch it, but it wasn't great.
It's very bad. I'm totally with you there. Thor 3 was excellent. I don't really like the first one either, though. You know, just it was fun in the moment, but watching it back, there's not much to it. It feels kind of boring.
The third one made you kind of wonder why they didn't inject that sort of personality into the first two movies, and so maybe it ruined the first one a little bit.
Right. I think Taika Waititi was the first director who really realized the comedic chops that Chris Hemsworth has and unleashed it. We could talk about this for a long time.
Well, if you think about it, since we're doing the Chicago Bulls player rankings for the decade, they're like the Thor 1 of NBA decade player rankings because it's not bad. Like it's Thor 2, but there's probably better case studies. Like there are Thor 3s out there, and it's just that the Chicago Bulls aren't it.
That was a really forced and yet pretty solid segue.
Let's get started. Let's get right into it, though. We have the top 10 players for the Chicago Bulls of the decade who turned up at number 10 in our composite ranking.
Yeah, I think this is the first time it's happened, but there was unanimity for the number 10 spot. The fans, me and you, all had Kirk Hinrich at number 10, which I think is it's a fun shout to a guy who most of his time in Chicago did not count for our purposes because he left, played for a couple of other organizations before coming back to Chicago for the 2012-13 season. But he was a solid role player, a solid offensive player who could distribute capably, who could shoot threes, and he played a fairly substantial part on 3 straight playoff teams. So I get why we all wanted him at 10, even if he's definitely not the most glamorous possibility there.
He was part of that subset of guards in Chicago that always seemed like they came up big during, that wasn't Derrick Rose is my point. Like those, remember the Nate Robinson run? Hinrich is obviously, he was in Chicago a lot earlier and then he was back there a little bit later. But we think about Nate Robinson, who was the other one? They just became novel. And I feel like I just remember him having a bunch of moments with Chicago, particularly after Derrick Rose did end up suffering his ACL injury, and he's back with the Bulls in 2012 through, I think it ended up being almost 2016 at that point. And I just remember him kind of, like you said, a solid playmaker, but just hitting shots and having games where it was, oh, Kirk Heinrich was really, really good. And that's just what I associate with him, is that subset of guards who were not Derrick Rose that always ended up coming up solid for the Bulls.
Yeah, and I think there's something to the Captain Kirk persona too, where just his importance in a leadership and mentor role really can't be overstated too. So he definitely fills the intangibles criteria as well.
And he shot fairly well for them from beyond the arc during the playoff stints that fall under this decade, 3 of them, in which, except for that latter one where he was 3 of 9 overall. And so just having that reliable. Oh no, I'm looking at 2-pointers there. That was a rough postseason for him. But it's sort of having the reliable game manager. I don't know if you would call him underrated, but I actually didn't expect him to turn up in number 10. I thought that either you or the fan vote and then the composite by extension might have ended up turning in a different number 10 guy. But we'll get into those with the honorable mentions, obviously.
Yeah, I've very strongly considered Mike Dunleavy for that spot, and it was a last minute change that had Heinrich grabbing the 10th spot for me.
I was torn with Larry Markkinen was the guy, and I still kind of regret spoiler alert, leaving him off the list.
Yeah, no, I didn't really consider Markkinen that strongly, just because to me he's shown what he can do mostly at the end of that 2018-19 season, where he caught fire and looked like a future star. But this current season has been disappointing for him. He hasn't been able to stay healthy. The offensive prowess has just kind of dried up. Maybe it's because there's not enough talent around him right now. Maybe it's because he's learning how to defer to more to guards that are controlling possessions more than they did early in his career. But yeah, the fans had Markkinen at number 9. We both had Nikola Mirotic at number 9, who did end up in that 9th place spot on the composite rankings.
Yeah, it's with Markkinen, to your point, there's definitely been, it seems like even the past 2 years, because he was injured last year, dealt with injuries this year, and even when he was on fire, didn't really feel like he kind of ever reached that extra level as a scorer. And I don't know how much of that is maybe the Jim Boylan impact. A big thing in 2018, 2019 was they just got him the ball in terrible spots, both on the court and in the shot clock. And then you look at the talent around him, and there's not necessarily a clear path to him, expanding his role, at least not clearly, particularly after the addition of Kobe White. And you figure on having Zach LaVine, you also want Wendell Carter Jr. to be able to do things. So it's definitely complicated for him. I almost regret not putting him on though. Nikola Mirotic has the there-ness factor over Markkinen when you look at the minutes played for the Bulls during this stretch. Only slightly though, 80 minutes played for the Bulls. He was sort of fascinating. Do you remember him as being overrated or underrated as a shooter? I kind of feel like I tilt towards more overrated, where it was you expected him to be like this really. We just called him this floor spacing 4, this knockdown shooter, and his percentages never really seemed to align with that during his time in Chicago.
Interesting. I'm in the opposite camp for him. I think that the overall numbers are dragged down by that rookie season in 2014-15, where he was really trying to adjust to playing in the NBA and playing in a competitive team where he didn't really have as defined a role. But after that, like as a sophomore, 39% on 5.2 attempts per game. He regressed in 2016-17, 34.2% on 5.4 attempts per game. But before he was traded to the Pelicans in 2017-18, like that was his magnum opus, 42.9% on 6.4 deep attempts per game. And it was that season where he really became like an offensive powerhouse in a smaller role. And I think that's probably more how I remember him, which is an inflated perception. But to me, the role that he grew in outweighed some of those struggles at the beginning of his career.
The rookie season probably, if you're willing to throw that out, which is totally fine, that probably contributes to it, because when you look at the splits, it's 31.6% from 3, then 39, but then it's down to 34.2, and then it's up to, before he was traded to New Orleans, 42.9 with the Bulls that year. And so there's definitely something to that there. Then it just felt like he was more of a seesaw, and that he grappled with this similar identity crisis to what Markkinen is going through now. I don't think he was ever supposed to be the level of player that Marketing is supposed to be or was supposed to be, depending on how out on him you are now. It probably doesn't help, though, when you look at how many injuries the Bulls dealt with during those beginning years when he was in Chicago. And so he's dealing with a lot of different types of not just personnel, but the means by which they play. And so that certainly could have dragged him down too. But he is a little bit synonymous with those, Joakim era post Rose being an MVP candidate Bulls, even though he comes in later into the equation. He's still kind of associated with that group.
Yeah, no, I'm in total agreement with all of that. I definitely don't put him in the same category as Markkanen. I think that he never displayed quite as much all around offensive potential. It was more just like the shooting stroke that buoyed his stock. So I never really felt like he was too much of a disappointment. He was just solid.
Yeah, I don't view him as a disappointment at all. I wonder if there's a case to be made to have. There's definitely one to have Markkanen over Heinrich. I wonder if you could also have him over Mirotic. Maybe not, though.
Yeah, unless you just weigh the peak that Markkanen had in late February of what was it, 2019, where everything clicked. I think that's the only real reasoning that I'd be okay with for having him ahead of him.
Attention Hardwood Knocks listeners. With currently no NBA, NHL, or MLB, you might think that there's nothing to bet on. Well, you'd be wrong. Our exclusive partner, BetOnline, still has hundreds of events, games, and props to wager on. From their online casino to poker and blackjack, they're bringing Vegas to you. Missing the NFL? No problem. BetOnline has live daily Madden NFL 20 simulations you can bet on. You can also bet on Survivor, Big Brother, American Idol, stock prices, even the Nathan's hot dog eating contest. All open 24 hours a day and all online. Use promo code BLUEWIRE to join today and receive your new welcome bonus. That's promo code BLUEWIRE, all one word. BetOnline, your online wagering experts. Who checks in at, I believe we had a tie for number 7 since we're then skipping number 8.
Yeah, we do have a tie for 7th place, and let's go ahead and start with Carlos Boozer, who's a really interesting figure in Chicago's recent history, just because solid offense, solid rebounding, not really much of a defensive presence. I think that he was largely underrated during his time in Chicago. It was obvious that he was no longer the dominant figure that he was with the Utah Jazz earlier in his career. But then again, that 2013 playoff run, that was a big deal for me. And one of the reasons that I had him at 7th, which is the same spot that both you and the fans had him. During the first round series against the Brooklyn Nets that went 7 games, 17.4 points and 10.6 rebounds per game, shooting 54.5% from the field. And then in the second round series, which was ultimately a loss to LeBron James's Miami Heat, the last 3 games of that series, he was a huge offensive contributor for that team and kept them in a lot of games that would otherwise have been blowouts. So just performing at that level with the spotlight as bright as it was my reasoning for having him up at 7.
I not that I view having him I had him at 8 in it, I believe. And so,
no, we all had him at 7.
Oh, yeah. We both had him. Oh, I did. Wow. Yeah. Well, anyway, I considered putting him lower, and I definitely wasn't going to put him any higher than 7. I think you initially might have had him a little bit higher. Definitely sort of a steadying scorer and rebounder during the regular season, but he was never the most efficient offensive player when it came to the playoffs. And he has, that I really consider memorable, one really good playoff campaign. And it's the one, I think it's the one where the Bulls played through 12 games. Was it that their conference finals year in 2012, 2013? Can't remember right now, but that to me, they made it to the semifinals. So I remember him being good that year, but I just don't really remember him having any hallmark playoff moments. And that's why I toyed with, hey, maybe Zach LaVine should go in front of him. Probably couldn't put him any lower than 7 or 8, but I was of the mind that I was really struggling to put him any higher. When you get into, not to spoil anything, but when you get into cases for, if you're trying to talk about Pau Gasol or Taj Gibson, if you want him on the level, I think Gasol would probably be the most likely one where people would debate between he and Boozer. And I struggled to, just from my playoff memories with Carlos Boozer, I sort of struggled to put him any higher than where we have him.
Right. And I do think that the there-ness factor that we've talked about in pretty much every one of these episodes now is important here as well. I didn't realize until looking it up while researching for these rankings that Boozer has played more games than Derrick Rose for Chicago this decade. He's fourth on that list. He's fifth in minutes played, also ahead of Rose, ahead of Kirk Heinrich and Mirotic. So that definitely has to matter here as well.
No, I'm totally with you. I think he's properly placed. His was just, he might have been the toughest one on the list among anyone for me to pinpoint.
For me, it was actually the guy he's tied with at number 7, which is Zach LaVine. LaVine showed up at 5th place in the fan vote. Both you and I had him at 8. Spoiler alert, Dan and I have like almost identical rankings throughout this entire Chicago Bulls podcast. I think there's only one difference where our 4th and 5th places are swapped. But yeah, LaVine was tricky for me because he has put up such massive scoring numbers and become such a reliable offensive presence. At the beginning of last season, when he was averaging like close to 30 points per game at the start of the year, it seemed like there was a possibility that he could even compete for a scoring title before James Harden decided to run away with that title. But those numbers haven't really led to many wins. During the 3 seasons that he's been in Chicago, 2017-18, they won 27 games. 2018-19, they won 22. They have only won 22 before the season was suspended, the current one we're in. So how do you balance those big offensive numbers that, to some extent at least, are stemming from opportunity that he likely would not be getting on a more competitive roster?
I do agree with you to some extent, and the reason he doesn't get above Boozer and maybe into the Gasol Gibson conversation is because he hasn't been to the playoffs, and there really isn't evidence that the way he plays elevates his teammates. And I think to expect him to be that guy probably miscasts him. But when you look at the players that have routinely been around Chicago, yes, Kobe White's good. Yes, Chris Dunn, before he was injured this year, was playing well, but they just haven't put a floor general next to him. Even with Thomas Satoransky, I really like Thomas Satoransky, but you don't have that floor general type, and it seems like he needs that type of guy around him. And yet, you look at the numbers, the Bulls' offense is not good with him on the floor, and I do think that matters. This isn't a Trae Young situation where Chicago would be competent, but then they'll fall off a cliff without LaVine on the floor. They are worse without LaVine on the court, but they're just also not great. And so that's when he is playing. And so there's the evidence that maybe he's not really going to uplift an entire offense with the way that he plays. What I will say, though, is when you look at his efficiency relative to the shots that he's taking, it's absolutely absurd. The fact that he's shooting 38% from 3 this year on the types of attempts that he takes, he's over 36.4% on pull-up triples. He's taking a lot of shots off the dribble. I know a lot of people were worried about him coming back from that ACL injury, and maybe we'll never see LaVine get to the line at a high clip. That might always just be a part of his game that we sort of lament. He's not D'Angelo Russell naked when it comes to free throw attempt rate, but he's not someone that you look at and say, oh, like you can really trust him to get there consistently. He still does get to the rim more than he was before the injury, looking just at the frequency with which he takes his attempts from point blank range. And so to have that guy, I really do think that there's value there. It just takes a very specific number one, someone that he is forced to defer to, I should say. And then that makes both his job easier and makes him better. And so I do still think there's a really good NBA player there, potential all-star. But like you, the lack of results in Chicago, that really has to hold them back. Again, it's not even just a matter of not making the playoffs, because you can look at these Bulls teams and you don't have to put their lottery berths on him. The fact that the offense, I think since he's been here, is not ranked higher than the 35th percentile when he's on the floor, that is telltale of something.
And the team's net rating has declined when he's on the court in 2 of his 3 seasons. And overall, over the course of those 3, they've been 1.7 points per 100 possessions worse when he's on the court. And that's not to say that he makes the team worse. That's one of those situations where maybe he's not elevating, but if you replace him with a lesser player in that same role, getting those same minutes, obviously the team's going to be worse off. It's interesting because I was going to make the Trae Young comparison as well for the exact same reason. Just looking at how Young has put up numbers that have elevated Atlanta's offense, and we haven't necessarily seen the same effect in Chicago with LaVine. The one thing I really want to see more from him, he's done a fantastic job throughout his career at improving his shot profile, especially the long twos. The frequency with which he's taken long twos has declined every single season of his career. He doesn't take floaters, though. And when he does, they're not good. Throughout his 3 years in Chicago, he's made 23.2% of his shots from between 3 and 10 feet. And that's the range where we so often see these explosive athletic guards. When that starts to click, everything starts to be better. Because if you're pulling a rim protector out where they have to respect that shot instead of just meeting you at the rim, you're making life a lot easier on yourself. And that's the spot where I really want to see him improve. And I think he can, just based on the touch he displays from the free throw line on 3-pointers. And as you mentioned, some of his shots are so difficult and he still makes them. So I have hope there, but that's the area where, like, if that clicks, he's going to skyrocket up these rankings.
And then maybe you do wonder a little bit what happens if he does have less control over the offense. Because there are a lot of players where I feel like rhythm or volume is important. And so if he can't dribble the ball 80 times before he's shooting as freely, could that have an adverse impact on his numbers? But he is one of the players where, look, we've seen a team try to build around him now. I'd be very curious to see what he looks like beside a more legitimate number one.
I am wholeheartedly with you.
Who's next up for us? Number 6.
Next up at number 6, we have Pau Gasol, who was 8th for the fans and was 6th for both of us. He was an all-star during both of his seasons in Chicago, and I think it's yet another example of my theory that he's one of the most underrated players in NBA history. I don't think he gets enough credit for the star he was with the Memphis Grizzlies. I don't think he gets enough credit for the role that he played alongside Kobe Bryant on the title-winning Los Angeles Lakers teams, and I certainly don't think that he gets enough credit for what he did in Chicago. He continued to be just an offensive stalwart who could contribute as a secondary facilitating hub, as a primary scorer, as a guy who was becoming more of a stretch big. But just because those teams weren't as competitive as the ones that we'd seen just a few years earlier with peak pre-injury Derrick Rose, and because he clearly wasn't operating quite at the same level that he did when he was in Los Angeles right before Chicago, I don't think he receives nearly enough credit.
When you had first sent me your rankings for the Bulls, I was floored that you had Pau Gasol so high. And then we ended up putting him in the same spot because I forgot just how incredible his numbers were during those 2 seasons with Chicago. You talk about, he all of a sudden really ups his 3-point volume, taking at least a similar, never had taken threes with that sort of volume. And he continued kind of doing it when he went to San Antonio. And to see him in that second year, he's averaging an attempt per game, which is a career high at that point, and shooting almost 35% from beyond the arc. That added real value just at that time in 2015, 2016. But his just overall numbers, when you look at his passing, 4.1 assists per game in that final year with Chicago. There's weird, obscured value in rebounding, but consistently getting double tallies there for Chicago. I really do wonder, too, what would have happened had he had been healthy for I think it was the 2015 playoff run or the 2016 playoff run that he wasn't there for. Maybe that Bulls team is just a lot better if he's available for that. So after looking at the numbers and sort of reminding myself, it seems like those 2 years were forever ago because everything feels like it's forever ago at this point. I ended up just being in full agreement with you because those 2 years in Chicago were spectacular, and he was contributing to good teams as well, which I really think needs to factor in.
Right. And I think it also matters that he was in his age 34 and 35 seasons during those 2 years in Chicago. We've seen in the last half decade that he was a decent lower minute contributor for the Spurs, and then he just kind of fell off the radar with the Bucks. I believe he was dealing with some foot injuries throughout his brief time in Milwaukee too. But like, that's a normal career arc for a guy who's in his late 30s. And I think it's just another reason that perception of him has kind of fallen off. But I mean, his rookie season in 2001, 2002, all the way through 2017-18, he averaged double-digit scoring totals every year. And that's something that not a lot of players can say over the course of 17 straight seasons.
Who do we have coming in at number 5?
So we're going to move on from my talking about how Pau Gasol is historically underrated to talk about Taj Gibson at number 5. He was number 6 for the fans. He was number 4 for me, and he was number 5 for you. One of the few spots where there wasn't agreement between at least two parties. But yeah, I mean, Gibson it like kind of exemplifies the there-ness concept for this franchise. Second in minutes played only to Jimmy Butler over the last decade. First in games played by 81 games, almost an entire season, more than anyone else. Never really became a floor spacing power forward, even though we originally thought that he could based on some of the mid-range results, but just a gritty, tough defensive player who set the tone for a lot of these hard-nosed Tom Thibodeau defenses.
And who also just basically for his entire Bulls tenure wasn't allowed to start until the very end. And I get there. Do you remember those debates? Whether Taj Gibson, he eventually started playing more than Carlos Boozer, but there were the debates that should he be starting over Carlos Boozer. And so I believe he started most of his games as a rookie when he was in Chicago. He did 70 starts. And then his final season in Chicago, which was a partial season in Chicago, he started all 55 games that he played in. But I really could only echo what you said. Just a solid guy. There was that baby pick and pop jumper. You wish he could have extended his range, but he was at least knocking those shots down in many of those seasons at an above average clip. Just another one of their gritty defenders that contributes to those teams where on paper it looks like they're shorthanded, but they're churning out comfortably above 500 records and their problems in the playoffs. He was a big part of all of that. I do sort of wonder what he looks like if maybe he plays more center with the Bulls. I know it wasn't necessarily an option for a lot of the time that he was there, but I feel like his game, particularly on offense, would have been much better suited for the 5 position, and maybe we appreciate him a little bit more. Not only if he gets more playing time consistently enough in Chicago, but if that's a role that he would have played more often as well.
Yeah, I feel like he basically did on defense just because of the pack the paint philosophies. Like the entire Thibodeau principle was that we're going to spend as much time in the paint as possible and kind of dare the officials to call us on lane violations on the defensive end. So he did spend a lot of time protecting the rim and guarding bigger players on the interior. So I think we got to see that fully realized defensive version of him. But I do agree with you on offense, where it would have been nice to see him working on drawing bigger bodies out towards the perimeter, and it might have facilitated further growth in that offensive arsenal.
Who do we have coming in at number 5?
So Gibson was number 5, but at number 4, we have Luol Deng, who was number 4 for both you and the fans, and was number 5 for me.
You talk about underappreciated. I feel like most people now only remember the Luol Deng that was in sort of, a tail end of Chicago. Then he goes to the Heat. Then he's with the Lakers. He was really, really good. There's the season, and that doesn't fall into this purview. But you're looking at the first season, Derrick Rose's MVP season. He averages 17.4 points, 2.8 assists per game. His 3-point shot always kind of came and went. There were seasons where he hit it at a higher clip. The years in which he took it with actual volume, though, it really dipped. He only had 2011, 2012, 4 attempts per game with 36.7% shooting from beyond the arc. One of the best perimeter defenders, though, of his specific era when he was healthy and in his prime, and the minutes that he would play. 2 seasons with the Bulls, he leads the league in minutes per game, averaged 39.4 minutes per game in the lockout season, which is a little bit wild. And then the following year leads the league in minutes per game again, 2012-2013, with 38.7. Just always so reliable in that respect. I do wonder, though, and I'm not trying to throw this at Tom Thibodeau, but how many careers has maybe that type of mindset that Chicago had during that time, some of which was born from necessity, because you look at what was going on with Derrick Rose, even Joakim Noah missed a lot of time. But does Luol Deng, if he's not playing through what seemed like a couple of knee injuries, I believe, during that span, is his career lengthier? Is he at least relevant for longer? And I think that's a fair question to ask. But during his time in Chicago, he was really good. I would say consistently he played at a fringe all-star level. And that's super valuable to have when you weren't necessarily, there were times where he needed to be the number 1 or the number 2, but that's not actually why you had him.
Man, you stole my talking point. I was gonna do some Tibbs bashing here because I do think that Deng is probably the most egregious example of all the careers that I don't want to say ruined, but were shortened by the inability to rely on the bench and the strange willingness to leave guys on the court forever. Deng was pretty much washed by the time he was 30, which is sad and not what you would expect from a guy who's able to contribute in so many different areas. You covered everything really well, but the only thing I wanted to add was it always felt to me like he was really reliable from the corners, even if the overall percentages weren't there. It seemed like so many times he was a bailout option in one of the corners, and that was a shot that you could really rely on and that I associate pretty strongly with this last decade of Bulls basketball. I'm just curious if you agree there.
I would agree. I want to see if you can answer this question. How many all defense teams did he make?
I don't think he ever made one.
He made one. And I actually thought that was low. I could have sworn that he made two.
Yeah, it's tough just because there are so many good wing defenders. And I think that some of the guys like him who do the dirty work and who are always taking those toughest assignments on the perimeter don't always get the credit they deserve, because he never really racked up steals or blocks like you see from a Kawhi Leonard or a Jimmy Butler. And that probably held him back there.
I'd agree. Who do we have at number 3? This is where things get – the top 3 were hard.
The top 3 were really tough. Everyone had the same 3 people in their top 3. They were barely separated in our composite rankings. But at number 3, we do have Derrick Rose, who was number 1 from the fans, which really doesn't surprise me. He was number 3 for both of us, and he did draw over half of the first place votes from fans as well. He did not appear on one ballot, which is interesting. He was 9th place on one, but other than that, he was in the top 4 for everyone. Rose didn't really play as much as we wanted him to, as we maybe remember him playing, because of all the injuries. But only 247 games. That's 5th place over the last decade for the Bulls. He's 6th in minutes played. But then that peak, the MVP season does count here. The ensuing season before the onslaught of injuries began does count here. And it's tough to balance the lack of volume you might expect with a superstar so associated with a franchise with that remarkable peak where, just one athletic layup or dunk after another, the pure explosion driving the basket, unlike what we've seen from almost every guard throughout NBA history.
Yeah, and look, it's not we're not trying to shit on him by putting him at number 3 either. I am not the season of Derrick Rose that I'm most impressed with was this past year in Detroit, where he was just legitimately good, and it came at a time where everyone was out on him. His MVP campaign was spectacular. I want to make that clear. I still would have given the award that year to LeBron James. What I think really hurts his case is that so the years that qualify for this decade in Chicago end up being 6 seasons. How many times was he the best player on the team during that span? And a lot of when you're going to say no in a few years, it's because he wasn't available, but that needs to be part of it. And so you already touched upon it. And he's actually, because of when you look at a lot of the turnover of the Bulls' supporting cast, he's actually fairly high in minutes played for the decade. He's 6th. Which is, that's solid, and that's enough to, if you're going to vote him one, I don't think it's something that I would actually quibble over, but the lack of availability following really his MVP campaign, or let's say just following the ACL injury in 2012, but even then he had missed, that was the lockout shortened year, and I think he'd missed 27 games during the regular season, and so that lack of availability specifically, didn't play played about half the year, let's say a little bit more than half the year in 2011, 2012, missed all of 2012, 2013, only appears in 10 games in 2013, 2014. That stretch really ends up hurting his, let's call it the there-ness factor for Chicago. And then he just wasn't the same player when he came back. And he put up numbers for, his first season where he played in 50-plus games, 2014, 2015. He averages over 17 points a game that season, but you see that his efficiency really starts to take a dip. And I do know, and people have criticized him for his failure to adjust on the court. I actually understand his struggles there. in that moment just because of how young he still was and the trajectory that he was on. That wasn't something that he was supposed to have to do. We see stars as they get older struggle to really assume role player duties. There are ones that have made the transition more seamlessly than most. Vince Carter is probably a good example, but it even took him a while to get there, and he battled his own health problems. And so this isn't me, and I'm assuming you as well, by putting him at number 3 behind the two players we're about to talk about. It's really not trying to take a shot at Derrick Rose. I just think his lack of availability and his struggles post ACL, they're enough to make it so that he is nowhere near a consensus number 1 or even number 2 player for this franchise over the course of this decade.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you. And that was part of the reason I really struggled with the order of these 3 players, because I think there's a valid argument for any of them in the number 1 spot. But yeah, I think those post ACL injury seasons were more detrimental than anything else, just because of the volume shooting coupled with diminishing efficiency, coupled with a decline in playmaking ability, because so much of his passing stemmed from those drives into the lane and then the kickouts. And when he's not gaining as much separation and creating as much space on those drives, the passing declined too. It was an all around dip, and it was a little bit too much for me to overlook. And then I think we also wanted to say on the Rose topic, and I apologize if I'm not phrasing any of this as well as I could. We did waffle with how we wanted to handle the rape accusations that stemmed from his time in Chicago recovering from an ACL injury. I don't really want to dive into the details of the case, but we ultimately didn't let that affect how we placed him in these rankings, because those were not made public and did not become a big storyline until his Chicago tenure was over. So it really did not affect the on-court element, which is all we were concerned with for these rankings. So if you wanted to drop him in your personal rankings because of the moral transgressions and because of what that does to perception of him as a person and a player in Chicago, that is totally valid, and we will in no way diminish those feelings. But we just wanted to explain that we did think about it, and that's ultimately how we chose to handle a sensitive topic.
Well said, and I echo everything that you just dropped. It was the focus tried to stay on basketball, but I won't fault anybody for holding him down in their rankings because of it. It's going to be a part of his legacy, and it can be a part of his Chicago legacy as well, but we were trying to look strictly at off-the-court rankings here. And so if anyone thinks that we put him too low at 3, that part of his legacy actually did not factor into us putting him at number 3.
And it's an interesting segue to number 2, which is Jimmy Butler. He was unanimously 2 for me, for Dan, and for the fans. And he was an example of where off-court decisions and behavior actually did impact the on-court product. And it's just because of the ugliness of his exit from Chicago to Minnesota in 2017. Maybe if he had handled that a bit differently, the trade return might have been a little bit different. They ended up trading him and Justin Patton to the Timberwolves for Chris Dunn, Zach LaVine, and Markkanen, which has worked out well, but could they have gotten more?
I mean, has it worked out well? Let's be fair.
I mean, I think that's fair, but at least you did get two consistent contributors out of it. But for me, that was an example of how obviously that's nowhere near as serious an occurrence, but because it did have a direct, tangible impact on the Chicago Bulls franchise, that made it harder for me to put him in the number 1 spot, which I originally did want to do because he was just so damn good during the end of his Chicago tenure. Like those last 3 seasons in Chicago, where he was a 20-point scorer, where it seemed like he was coming up big in crucial moments every time, where he was developing into more of a playmaker for his teammates, a reliable shot maker who could create more for himself. I think that was, aside from Rose's MVP season, the best basketball we've seen played by any member of the Bulls in the last decade.
You almost sort of forget that prime Jimmy wasn't really in, the best of Jimmy Butler wasn't in Chicago for as long as you remember that he was, because his minutes were just curbed his first 2 seasons. He barely played as a rookie. And then even that third year when he was playing a ton of minutes, they didn't really give him the keys to the offense. Like I think that was something that they like he showed out in the playoffs that year. I think it was in the 2012-2013 playoffs is kind of what put him, it seems, on like Thibodeau's map. But they didn't really start giving him like real control over the offense in the following season. Like it took a while for him to get there. And so, you mentioned those final 3 seasons in Chicago where he's clearing 20 points per game and turns into kind of this secondary playmaker. That wasn't really like those were the 3 seasons. Like when you're ranking Jimmy Butler's time with the Bulls, maybe you do look at that 2013 postseason. Maybe you do look at the fact that, in 26 minutes a game, he plays in all 82 games in 2013 during the regular season, really establishes himself as this hard-nosed defender. Like that certainly matters and it's part of it. But it's those final 3 seasons, 2014, 2015, 2015, 2016, 2017, that really make his case. And I think it's fair to say that maybe he's the best player the Bulls have had on their team this decade, but I don't think he was at his best or at his most ideal for long enough in Chicago to supersede the guy that we ultimately placed in front of him.
And I think part of that is just the story of how he became a star. At Marquette, he never became anything indicative of a future NBA superstar, which is why he came off the board at 30th in the 2011 NBA draft. And, it took him a few years to carve out that role. He only played 8.5 minutes per game as a rookie. It wasn't until his junior season where he really earned a bigger role because of his defensive abilities, but he couldn't shoot that year. He slashed 39-7, 28-3, 76-9 during that 3rd season. And then everything clicked in the 4th year. And that was the beginning of that 3-year span that really elevates him into this spot. But I did want to ask you, do you think Jimmy Butler is going to be a Hall of Famer? And if so, what jersey is going to represent him?
Wow.
Basketball Reference's Hall of Fame probability, which is based on how players have fared in certain statistical categories that tend to correlate with entry into the Hall of Fame, gives him a 42.5% chance right now. I would imagine that's only going to go up because he's only 30 years old. He's currently playing at a very high level despite some shooting struggles for the Miami Heat. And I think we have at least a few more peak seasons. So I would imagine he's going to finish his career north of 50%. But has he made too many ugly exits from places and ostracized too many people with his ridiculously sleep-deprived work ethic?
Yeah, everyone needs to get up at 3 a.m. so that they can go work out with Jimmy Butler. That is not healthy, by the way, just for anyone.
Do not recommend.
I'm not a sleep expert because I don't get enough of it, but I definitely know that getting up at 3 a.m. to work out after you probably didn't go to bed till at least 11 or 12 is definitely not healthy. My guess would be he gets into the Hall of Fame. That would just be my gut guess. I would say as of right now, he has to go in with the Bulls. That could change if he ends up spending as much time in Miami. Let's say he makes it through all 4 years of this contract, or the first 3, opts out, signs another 4-year deal, and ends up playing, I'll say, a half decade or longer in Miami, and just the going there is smoother. Maybe he makes it to a finals. If he wins a title in Miami, he'll certainly go in with the Heat, would be my guess there. As of right now, though, I'll say he'll go into the Hall of Fame, and then he's just going to be most remembered for his time with the Bulls. And because part of his stardom is the route by which he got there. And
right.
and that's where Chicago just comes in, where it's, everyone might have talked about his work ethic when he was first drafted by the Bulls, but he went from playing, 8.5 minutes per game through 42 regular season games in the 2011-2012 regular season, barely playing in the playoffs that year, to then all of a sudden he's just super important to what they're doing on one side of the floor, and then jump ahead 2 more years and he's also their best offensive player.
Right. But to be clear, you're ruling out the Minnesota Timberwolves as an option?
If we have, as Zach Lowe has talked about this a lot, if we have like a Hall of Fame weirdness part of, like if there's a weirdness sector of the Hall of Fame, we definitely need to put
with Karl Anthony Towns for sure.
Yeah, Jimmy Butler's tour de force, where he preferred to play with the third stringers and beat up on Minnesota starters. That has to go in there.
Yeah, I can't argue with that.
Everyone should know who number 1 is, but can you say it for us, Mr. Frommel?
I can. It's Joakim Noah. He was 3rd place for the fans. He was 1st place for both of us. I don't have any regrets about that, just because I think the consistency with which he contributed throughout his time in Chicago. We don't get to count the first 3 years of his career, but it really wasn't until the third one where he developed into just this relentless defensive contributor who really sparked Chicago's ability to establish its entire defensive identity. His ability to shut down the interior and to show off some lateral quickness, switching on to other players, and then his ability to facilitate as a big man was just massive. He never scored more than 12.6 points per game in Chicago, and yet it just didn't matter. He didn't need to score to be a hugely impactful player, which is why we saw him finish fourth place in the MVP voting in 2014, which is probably, looking back on it, maybe a little bit of an overreaction to the season that he had for a really good team. But still, like, he absolutely deserved consideration on the ballot despite not even averaging 13 points per game. And that's something we can't say about a lot of players, but it is something you can say about a DPOY who is also one of the best passing bigs with one of the weirdest shooting forms we've seen.
Yeah, he basically releases it at the hips.
Like it's a sidewinding push shot. Yeah.
So awkward when he was not even just airball free throws, but when you watch his live jump shots, like game action jump shots, those are the ones those hit a little different, or really they don't hit at all. But anyway, is number 4 really severely overrating the season he had that year? Maybe James Harden that season.
Yeah, I think it is a little bit. I mean, Harden, I think you can make an argument for Steph that year as well. I think Chris Paul is always undervalued.
When you look at his impact on both sides of the floor for Chicago, with the exception of LeBron James that season, when you look at everyone who's in the top, I guess aside from Chris Paul, in the top 7 of MVP voting, I'm not sure anyone else aside from Chris Paul and LeBron James had more of a two-way impact on their team. If you want to throw Kevin Durant in there, that's fine. 2013.
I kind of want to throw Kevin Love in there too. I know that the Timberwolves were awful. Yeah, but I mean, I'm always against the argument about like all around value there, because if you're that good on offense, even if you're bad on defense, it still outweighs being decent on both ends, which Noah wasn't decent on both ends. He was good on both ends, but like that was a season Love averaged 26, 13, and 4, and I think that there's an argument there too, just because I don't personally believe that team success should factor into MVP voting as much as it does, but that's admittedly a personal bias here. I think that Noah had a case for 4. I'm just not sure that he would have been there for me, but regardless, like he belonged in the discussion.
Yeah. I mean, look, he anchored the second best defense in the league that year. And I guess the case against him would be I think what really sells me on the 2-way argument for him is because of how important he actually was to the offense. Like it wasn't just someone who was setting screens and rim running. Like they relied on him for his facilitating. Yeah. The counterpoint to this would be that the Bulls had the 3rd worst offense in the league that year when they were so reliant on him, the same season that Derrick Rose played in only 10 games. And so I definitely could go back and relitigate the MVP voting for sure. But 2013-2014 was peak Joakim Noah and is the season I'll just always remember from him. He absolutely deserved the Defensive Player of the Year award. And he's another one of the players, and maybe we'll look back and say this about Jimmy Butler a little bit. We already said it about Deng, but if he didn't play for Tibbs for so long, I just wonder if he's, more relevant in the NBA for a longer stretch of time after leaving the Bulls. Shout out to the Knicks, though, for signing him in 2016 while bidding against absolutely nobody. So
this isn't a dream, and it really happened, right? That he signed with the Clippers and was preparing for some sort of comeback before the season was suspended?
Yeah. No, it wasn't a dream. And also, he was really good when he played for Memphis last year for a little bit more than half the season. Small burst, but you know what? That's fine. And he, what he does, he'd be harder for teams to play now than he was, 4 or 5 years ago, just because I don't know, how is he going to move on defense now? Prime Joakim Noah could really chase guys around, but now you factor in a slowed down version of Noah with the lack of floor spacing on offense, you probably can only get away with him for maximum 12 to 16 minutes a game, but that's also fine. I would have welcomed seeing him play again because he actually was pretty good in Memphis last year.
So if you're starting a team from scratch, how would you rank Noah's 2013-14 season, Jimmy Butler's 2016-17 season, his final one in Chicago, and Derrick Rose's MVP season in 2010-11?
I'm taking Jimmy's final season in Chicago.
Really?
There's just look. I'm going to appreciate the efficient 3-point shooting from him that year on let's call it modest volume, 3.3 attempts per game and above the league average. And then when you're looking at what Noah could do best, it wings who can face up and guards as well. They're just going to have inherently more influence over the outcome on offense. And then so if you want to say Derrick Rose, his MVP campaign was better offensively than Jimmy Butler during his final year in Chicago, I would probably agree with you, but now we have to factor in what Jimmy Butler does as an individual defender at the other side of the floor. And then I think that's what really sways me there. If Derrick Rose was a better 3-point shooter that season, or really at any point during his career in Chicago, maybe you can tilt the scales toward him. For me personally, you're free to pick whoever you want, but the answer is pretty clearly Butler for me.
So I think Rose had the best of the 3 seasons, but it's also the one that I would least like to build around, just because I think you can find the poor man's version of that most easily. And that's kind of why I would pick Noah's over Butler's, just because of scarcity. Yeah, I think it's easier to find some sort of replacement for Butler on the wings. I think it's much harder to find that true defensive player of the year candidate who's also capable of serving as an offensive hub. So if I'm starting from scratch, like, I think that's the most valuable addition to my team that makes it easier moving forward and placing players around him.
Fair enough. People are going to take this as a Derrick Rose slam podcast, but it's really not.
No, I mean, I think he had the best season of any Bull over this decade.
Who are our honorable mentions that we can run through?
Right. So we had in the fan vote, moving beyond the Tiratich at number 11. Again, he was number 9 for both of us. And then we venture into uncharted territory here. We have Nate Robinson at 12. We have Dwayne Wade at 13, which I guess some hometown bias there maybe. I couldn't figure out why he got so much love, considering how little time he's spent in a Bulls uniform and how we kind of try to forget that happened.
Yeah, that 13 is way too high for Dwayne Wade. We don't even need to go deep into that.
So tied at 14, we have Kyle Korver and Ben Gordon. Tied at 16, we have Ronnie Robin Lopez. Tied at 18, we have Mike Dunleavy, who I strongly considered putting in my top 10, and Keith Bogans, who I did not consider putting in my top 10. At 20, we have a tie between Bobby Portis and Rajon Rondo. At 22, we have a tie between Doug McDermott and Wendell Carter Jr. Maybe a little too early for Wendell Carter Jr.
I like where their head's at, though.
Yeah, it's maybe a little projection there. Tied at 24, we have a very interesting group of guards. We have Rip Hamilton, we have Cam Payne, we have Jamal Crawford, and we have Jimmer Fredette, who somehow got a 6th place vote. I thank Jimmer for voting in our polls.
I was going to say, shout out Andrew D. Bailey for voting.
Also a possibility. At 28, we have Jabari Parker. At 29, we have a tie between Justin Holiday, Kobe White, Tomas Satoransky, and Omer Ashik, who I was surprised that Ashik didn't get a little bit more love just because of his defense over his time in Chicago. And then tied at 33rd, we had C.J. Watson and Otto Porter Jr., and finally, in a tie for 35th, we had Andres Nocioni, Antonio Blakeney, Shaquille Harrison, DJ Augustine, and Chris Dunn. Names that I did not anticipate saying today.
I will say I've heard stories that Shaquille Harrison defends his ass off in practice. So maybe they were waiting that. That's fair.
I hope so. Because I'm not sure what the other argument is. Aside from the name, maybe you got him confused with Shaquille O'Neal. Like, I get that. It happens.
I'm disappointed Aaron Brooks didn't get any love. He was the other small guard that I was thinking of that would go kaboom from time to time during his...
Yeah, that one season.
Yeah, so actually, this seemed like of the teams we've done so far, this is number 5. I feel like it had the least egregious honorable mentions. Dwayne Wade at 13 is pretty bad, but it's also Dwayne Wade, and he's his own brand.
Yeah, I didn't really have many qualms with the other ones. Maybe Keith Bogans, but I think that was a trolling ballot, I want to say, because they had Carlos Boozer in first place, Ronnie Brewer in second, and Keith Bogans in third.
That seems high.
Shout out to whoever went that route. I would love to hear how you value certain things on the basketball court. seems like a good discussion to have. But yeah, I think that there were fewer egregious responses here.
Well, Adam, this was fun as always. We have the Cleveland Cavaliers coming up next, I believe.
We do.
We will be recording those at some time in the near future. If you guys are enjoying these podcasts, please remember to rate, review, subscribe to us on iTunes. Definitely remember to participate in all the polls that Adam is throwing up. Follow NBA Math at NBA_math. That's where all those surveys are going up. And we will have a landing page for you by the time you listen to this on NBAMath.com with all the podcasts we have recorded for each team. You can also go on YouTube, search Hardwood Knocks. You will find a playlist where we have all the decade rankings. And again, please subscribe, rate, and review to us on iTunes. We haven't had some written reviews in quite a while. The ratings are going up a little bit, but we'd like to see both of those just inflate just a little bit more. So write us some reviews, throw us some ratings, subscribe, tell your friends, family, enemies, random people on Twitter, because hopefully you're not seeing them in person at the moment. Until next time, though, we leave you with a shout out to Keith Bogan.